Hi, gang. Brief run through of some notes for our meeting tomorrow on Thursday. Just to bring to a close the crusading era, talk a little bit more specifically about the First Crusade, and then where we're headed into the next couple chapters with chapters 11 and chapters 14. Again, just some of the big things that hopefully you picked up from the BBC video that we've been looking at, that primarily the roll call of who went on crusade is in that last paragraph of page 303 of your text. Am I going to ask you a question on the next quiz or the final exam? Who was Godfrey of Bouillon, or who was Beaumont of Toronto? No, I don't do that. You guys know that by now, but you need to have some of those major figures down to add to your answers, to fill out your answers with good W's. All right. Remember, no kings, just primarily first and second rank nobles went, and these were the leaders of the military aspect of the Crusades. As we talked about yesterday, and hopefully you saw in the video, and we'll re-enhance for today, this was a completely and in many ways utterly disorganized and reckless affair, with numbers being very sketchy. 60, some, like I said, some numbers put it at 100,000, somewhere in between there. 60 and 100,000 is probably the best bet. And we talked about yesterday how Pope Urban II, with that plenary indulgence, really emphasized going on crusade as a method of self-purification, even something along those lines. The sources, hopefully you guys are getting into some of those really good sources on the siege of Jerusalem and the massacre of Jews in Germany, the Rhineland and other places. Just absolutely hammering home that point of how zealous and quite overzealous the population of Europe had become in the Middle Ages to take on this crusade with such fervor, such piety, and such zealousness. I think it's good to read those primary sources as well. This is a fantastic popular manifestation of faith. That's a word that I want to talk about here for a little bit on our notes. You have from time to time in history manifestations of faith, where you can actually see intangible things like belief and faith manifest themselves in tangible ways. Okay, the Crusades is certainly one of those. We're going to look at another one in next week. We'll get into it with the cathedral building time period during the Middle Ages, where people will take this intangible thing. It's hard to quantify faith. It's hard to quantify, those types of things with numbers. But you can do that with things like the Crusades and with cathedral building, where you can see tangible things. You can see physical manifestations of how faithful, pious, zealous the population of Europe was. Okay, and like we talked about, the numbers were sketchy. The plan was sketchy. The only plan was to, just get to Constantinople, and we'll figure out what happens then. As your book talks about, towards the end of, not towards the end of the chapter, but on those pages 299, to 303, etc. I especially like the bottom of page 302 into 303, where it talks about some of the objectives, but also what happened to like the first band of crusaders. It talks about how the first crusade sometimes is known as the Peasants' Crusade. Bottom of page 302 talks about a guy named Peter the Hermit. Not a lot known about him, just a charismatic figure. But the point is that what you understand is when these zealots, the people who engaged in that large-scale slaughter of Jewish populations in Germany, the Rhine River Valley, When these zealots arrived at Constantinople, page 303, Alexius hurried to transport them across the Bosporus into Asia Minor, where the Turks quickly decimated them. This is another one of those things that the Crusades, the early part of the Crusades came in waves, and the main military body, the contingent, the big guys with the knights, came behind the very uncontrolled and out of control zealous peasant population who had gotten there first. It makes sense why those people would get there first, and the main noble knightly body of the Crusades would come in second, because they had more stuff to prepare, they had more stuff to bring with them. So I like that story there, recounted in your book, and how just, again, completely and utterly disorganized and reckless a lot of this stuff was. Some brief things to bring up about the main objectives. We talked about these yesterday. A big one, yes, for glory, for material profit, for fief, for kingdom, all right? But another one, and this can't be discounted, is a lot of people went for God. A lot of people went because of that plenary indulgence, which Urban II grants. And make sure you get that term down again from page 297, a plenary indulgence, a get out of purgatory free card. Like we talked about yesterday, you bypass purgatory and you get right into the pearly gates of heaven. This picture here that I'm showing you now is from an illuminated French manuscript depicting the massacre of Jews. And you can see from this French manuscript up here, you can see Jesus kind of looking on. It's hard to tell if Jesus is giving his blessing, if he's sort of saying, what are we doing here? But you can see the swords being raised against the Jewish individuals down here. You can see them ready to be massacred. Disgusting aspect of the First Crusade. And again, we emphasize that anti-Semitic behavior and anti-Semitic belief is got a long and ugly history, which made its way through medieval Europe as well. The past of the Crusades are here. Talks, shows you first, second, third, fourth Crusades. Don't get too bogged down into these names and stuff like this, but I want to show you guys that a lot of these paths follow traditional Roman roads and Roman routes via land and sea. You can see an instance, during the Third Crusade, a lot more, I don't want to call it naval, because it wasn't necessarily navy, but it was a lot more travel by sea because of Philip Augustus, Richard the Lionhearted. These types of guys had so much more wealth at hand, where they could put a lot of troops and things onto the boats and things like that. That noise in the background, of course, is my dog Chandler taking a gigantic drink of water right in the middle of me trying to get some notes out. So apologize for that. She is the biggest stooge of a dog that ever came down the pike, but I love her nonetheless. The crusading spirit, as you can see here, endures for centuries. As we talked about yesterday, one of the most interesting aspects of the Crusades is how the medieval Europeans brought feudalism with them to an area that wasn't used to feudalism or hadn't been practicing feudal aspects. And that was one of the things, again, that Alexius Comnenus, the Byzantine emperor, was so very confused about and so very upset about, was that when these crusaders came, they stayed and they set up feudal states. You can see them here with the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the earldom, all the names, all the kingdoms, those types of things, all there with dates given to you in the key there. The end of chapter 10 does a really nice job of showing you the extent of the Second Crusade, 1147, the Third Crusade, the most famous crusade, called in 1189. Brief background on those in chapter 10. Read through that. for your knowledge, for your W's, for your Jeopardy knowledge. If you ever get on Jeopardy, those are all good things to have in your back pocket there. But the big point with those later crusades, every crusade after the first one, is they fail. They utterly fail to regain the city of Jerusalem. Okay, the only one to gain the city of Jerusalem for a brief period of time was that first crusade. All right. Other than that, Jerusalem remained in firm control of the Islamic powers within the region, which they themselves, and hopefully picked up from this from the BBC video documentary, is that they themselves, the Islamic powers, were constantly interfighting with one another. They did not present a cohesive unit by any stretch of the imagination during the Crusades. This whole era is rife with not just Christian versus Muslim violence, but infighting amongst the Christians and the Muslims as well, to see who would control these very important trading routes, these very important ancient cities full of money, full of relative urbanity for the time. The crusading spirit does endure for the next 100 years until we see 1291, when the last Crusader stronghold at Acre will fall. And that kind of brings to a close the crusading era in 1291. By that point, Europe had moved on to other things, which we're going to begin to talk about in chapters 11 and 14 with the cathedral building era. Europe will turn a lot of its pursuits inward to scholastic endeavors, scholasticism, the building of universities, those types of things. A lot of mental, pious, zealous energy will be turned inward to other things besides just the Crusades. I do want to mention the Fourth Crusade, called by Pope Innocent III, who is the guy that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of weeks. He's probably, if you're looking for like the most powerful pope of all time, Innocent III might take that title. I would vote for Innocent III as being the most powerful political and religious pope in the history of the papacy, not just the Middle Ages. He will call his own crusade, the Fourth Crusade in 1204. By this point, the Comnenus dynasty, the descendants of Alexius, were so fed up with and done with the Western Crusaders coming for the first 100 years that they basically shut the gates of Constantinople, and they said, you're not coming in. You're not going to refuel here. You're not going to get your horses water here. We're not going to even open the gates of Constantinople for you anymore. We are tired of this Western incursion from medieval Europe. And what ensues in 1204 is the frightening siege of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade, where they will essentially choke out. They will siege Constantinople. They will begin to destroy its extremely powerful triple-tiered wall, buttress formation that it had set up all the way back with Constantine and Theodosius in the 300s. This was a triple-tiered wall system that had made Constantinople basically impregnable for 1,000 years. The Crusaders will begin to tear down these walled structures in an attempt to get into Constantinople, and it will have profound and long-lasting effects for the history, not just of late medieval Europe, but of the early modern world, as you can see from the notes here. When the Turks eventually will attempt to take Constantinople by force, they will be able to do so in the year 1453. Now, that's outside the bounds of our medieval course. That's for modern Europe, early modern European history. But the point is, 1453 is such a huge date because that's when Constantinople switches over. It turns now into Istanbul and remains to this day one of the glittering jewel highlight cities of the Islamic world. And that city is taken in 1453 mainly because the Byzantine Empire was unable to rebuild these fortifications, these walled structures that the Crusaders will tear down in 1204. Terrible episode, to be sure. I want to show you this slide briefly, mainly not because of the routes of the Crusaders, but down here, bottom left corner of the map, key. look at the religious breakdown now that we have throughout the crusading era. What we have is certainly you have Latin Christendom in a very unified way, becoming the major Roman Catholic stronghold. You have in the Middle Eastern world that blending that had gone on due to the invasion of the Turks, where now this Anatolian Peninsula, what is modern day Turkey, will begin to blend and eventually will become fully Islamic throughout the 1200s, 1300s, and into the 1400s. And then you have down here in the southern Mediterranean, from North Africa stretching over to Egypt and then up into the modern day Middle Eastern states here of Syria, Israel, Palestine, Iraq, Iran. This is going to be a completely Islam, Muslim community at this point. The interesting thing here, if we want to look at the Iberian Peninsula, aka Spain, you're going to now see a concentrated focus towards the back end of the crusading era and then during the 1300s and 1400s to fully push any Islamic influence off and out through the bottom of Spain and across the Bosphorus into, excuse me, not the Bosphorus, but of course across the Straits of Gibraltar here into North Africa. And that, guys, is known as the Reconquista. It's a very long process. I love this map because it shows the various different colors of how Islam was pushed further and further and further and further south until finally, when the Spanish crowns of Aragon and Castile will unite in that very famous union between Ferdinand and Isabella, where we get this thing now known as Spain, the nation of Spain. In the 1400s, Ferdinand and Isabella will unite the crown of Spain. Portugal will remain the one state that holds out, and they will become their own country in and of itself here on the western coast of the Iberian Peninsula. And as you can see here, Islam by the late 1400s has been completely formally pushed off of the Spanish Peninsula. And again, that is formalized in 1492, which is, again, another very famous date throughout the history of the world, certainly with Ferdinand and Isabella, and then, of course, with Christopher Columbus. So that brings to an end those notes for the crusading era. For tomorrow and then for getting into the rest of the weekend, I'd love it if you could get into chapters 11 and then even start to peruse chapter 14. Chapters 11 really starts to get into the focus on intellectual pursuits. The recovery of Aristotle, page 319. Make sure you're picking up on that. We're going to start to get into some proofs of God's existence. See, the thing is that we're going to look at starting tomorrow and then into the weekend and next week is people start to figure out that as more is discovered about the world, physical traits, all kinds of scientific-y type stuff, people want to prove certain theological things. They want to prove God's existence. Is that possible? I don't know. I think a lot of these proofs that we're going to read by St. Anselm, by other types of figures, including Thomas Aquinas, are going to be interesting philosophical things where people literally try to prove that God exists. And so what they say is they're going to say, yes, God exists through Scripture, certainly, but we can also prove that God exists by looking at other things in our physical world. And that's the Aristotle, that's the Aristotelian aspect of it, is that we can find things in the physical world here that prove that God exists. And to me, that's a really interesting medieval pursuit. Chapter 14, if you want to get into that, or rather, the end, the end of chapter 11 starts to get into the university. So make sure you're picking up on the foundation of the universities, what they were all about, how they grew out of church, monastery schools, and became more centered in the cities. And then if you start to get in chapter 14, that's where we start to get into Thomas Aquinas and cathedral building and all those other types of things. So that's where we're heading in the future, chapters 11 and chapters 14. If you got any questions or anything, don't hesitate to canvas message me, email me, and hopefully we can view this before class tomorrow. And if not, view it over the weekend, and we'll get into those chapters going forward. All right, until then, see you guys in the Zoom room tomorrow.